Last week, we got the rundown on how to grow our own delicious fruit right in our backyards. Now we are learning about what fruits are native to the Lowcountry. I'm joined by a plant expert and your local extension agent, Chris Burt, to tell us all about it. Thanks for being here, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. Okay, so we've been diving into fruits, which is fun because we love fruits.
Of course.
What fruits are native to the Lowcountry?
So it's actually more than you think. And I mentioned a couple of them last week, but blueberries are probably the go-to most people think of. So the entire blueberry group of plants are actually native to North America, and we have several species that are native to South Carolina. Oftentimes the blueberries that you're buying are usually hybridized or bred to produce a certain amount of fruit, but for the most part we oftentimes will call those native, but blueberries are really one of the best examples. But there's actually several others. So we have things like the Chickasaw and American plum, which if you want to grow plums, this is probably not the one that you're growing for the fruits themselves, but they do still produce a good preserve, and they're really good for the birds. Of course, things like crab apples. So crab apple, of course, we're not going to necessarily get the big red delicious, but hey, crab apples can actually be processed and you can make different things with it. And again, another one really good for the birds. And then you start getting into some more interesting ones like mulberries. Mulberry is one of the prettiest trees that you can think of. The fruits are delicious. Problem is the wildlife thinks so too. And then of course you get into things like your American persimmon. So there's a lot of different fruits that are native, and then we start really getting into kind of the weird ones, like things like prickly pear cactus. You don't think about as being native here. There's several species of blackberries that are actually native here. So, and then of course you look along the ditches, especially in the spring, you see all those white flowers. It's elderberries, which are also native
Those are
here.
Good for immune systems.
Very good
right?
for,
yeah.
yes. But so those are also native. So there's a lot that is native here. Oftentimes we don't think about these things being, hey, that's a fruit tree, that's a fruit bush, but they actually are, and of course they are native.
How common is it to find these native fruits that are picked right here in our, basically, not our actual backyards, but basically right here in our backyard? How common is it to find these at restaurants or at our local grocery stores?
Occasionally you'll see them at restaurants. Very unlikely you'll see them at grocery stores. So one of the ones that actually is gaining in popularity, mostly because of how interesting it is the pawpaw. So of
What
course,
is that?
The pawpaw, it's also known as a custard apple. Or
Custard apple, that sounds amazing.
It's got actually several different common names, but it's the largest tree fruit in North America. And of course, it's native here. But it is one, it has a very short shelf life. And so oftentimes you won't see it necessarily bought and sold. Similar to persimmons, the native persimmon is astringent, which just means you have to wait till it's fully ripe in order to eat it, which unfortunately means that it doesn't tend to have a very long shelf life. And so a lot of those types of fruits, unfortunately, are just not going to be found very often. Of course, your blueberries are, but oftentimes the blueberries we see in the store are the ones that are coming from up north or coming from, places like Canada, because they grow a lot of blueberries up there versus we just don't tend to have as much of the industry here. Really, the fruit we're seeing sold here is going to be, of course, the telltale peaches, which are not native, unfortunately.
Interesting. And we just looked at a picture of a bee on a flower. How do bees play into all of this? So,
well, a lot of our native fruits actually have specialized bees. And so there's actually hundreds of native pollinators. And a lot of times when we talk about native plants, really the emphasis is that interaction with wildlife, which we talked about several weeks ago. But it's that same concept when we talk about native fruits, is that interaction with wildlife. And so things like blueberries actually have a specific bee that is going to really prefer blueberry plants. And of course, blueberries bloom relatively early in the season, and so they're blooming when everything else really isn't. And that bee specifically is going to really prefer that species to go to. If there isn't any, unfortunately, that bee really doesn't have any food to eat. And so it's that same concept. Things like again, a lot of the fruits that I've mentioned already, these are really important food sources, not just for bees, but also for other insects as well as birds and other wildlife.
So we really need the bees.
We do, very much so. And oftentimes we think of bees as far as the honeybee, but we kind of forget that, those hundreds of native species of bees are actually the ones that are in decline, and those are the ones we probably should focus on.
Interesting, interesting. All right, so we're in the fall season. Which of our native fruits are best right now in the fall?
So one of my favorites is the persimmon.
Yes.
So the American persimmon, is, as well as the Asian persimmon. Both of those are really starting to ripen right now. The American persimmon's really fun because if you get it too early, it'll be kind of hard, but it'll be astringent, which it means it's got some tannins in it that keep it from being very palatable, kind of makes your mouth pucker a bit. But if you wait till it's fully ripe, it's absolutely delicious. And again, it's impossible to find in the store, but you can get it fresh off the tree if you find it just right.
I always make fall salads. Usually for Thanksgiving, my job is always to make a salad, and I always get a recipe with persimmons in it. But it's kind of hard to tell because sometimes you're like, oh, did I wait too long? Is it too soft, too juicy? But I'm sure you know exactly when all the fruits are perfectly ripe.
Well, you try to, but I mean, even I can make mistakes. And I will say most of the fruits, even if it's not fully ripe, oftentimes you're not too terribly concerned. The key is obviously as it gets softer, that's usually when the more sugars are available.
And we talk about, bees, losing a lot of our bees here that are native to the area. Are we losing any of that, local native fruit? Is there anything we can do to make sure that none of that goes away? Yeah,
so you are seeing several species. I mean, the pawpaw is actually a really good example. Unfortunately, a lot of the wildlife that consumed pawpaws several thousand years ago, unfortunately, don't exist anymore. One of the big ones being the giant sloth.
Oh.
And so a lot of the megafauna, which are would have eaten that and spread the seed around, don't exist. And also some of the pollinators don't seem to exist anymore. So the pawpaw is somewhat in decline, at least in the wild. And it's such a cool tree because, I mean, it has natural chemicals that keep it from getting disease and insect pressure. It's a really good, it's a host plant for several different caterpillars. So it's a very important tree, but unfortunately it's kind of decreasing, not necessarily because of us, but of course we are contributing as well. But one of the best things we can do is just try to plant as many of them as possible.
Perfect. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being here for Planting Palmetto yet again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course.